Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this rainy Monday afternoon. For those that have continuously watched our webinars, thank you. Welcome back. If this is your first time watching, whether live or recorded, thank you for joining us today. So my name is Cassandra Francis. I am the founder as well as CEO at One Piece Therapy. And I'm also one of the practitioners as well. And today we have Janel led presenting on breaking down the fences, exploring ways to effectively communicate with your loved ones and understanding defense mechanisms. So definitely interested to learn and hear more, but I will leave it to you.
Okay, thank you, Cassandra, for that beautiful introduction. So like Cassandra has stated, we will be talking today about breaking down our defenses. So specifically exploring ways to effectively communicate with our loved ones and understanding just the general components to defense mechanisms today. Okay, so let's get started. So we will start with just so Cassandra, that's the second slide, which is what are defense mechanisms, right? So the term was coined by Sigmund Freud in 1844. He noted a bunch of ego defenses, which he refers to throughout all of his written works. And then later, after he passed away, his daughter, Anna Freud, also developed additional defense mechanisms, which she also added to the list. And even other psychoanalysis psychologists over the years have also added additional defenses to this list as well. And as we go forward, we'll talk about what some of those are. We can define them. So a good definition would be a psychological strategy that we use unconsciously to protect ourselves from anxiety arising from unacceptable thoughts and feelings, right? So according to the Freudian theory, defense mechanism evolve in a distortion of reality in a manner that we are better able to cope with a situation, right? So they arise when we feel uncomfortable, when there's anxiety in us, so that we're able to better deal with the situation ahead of us, right? So his daughter, Anna Freud, she defined these defense mechanisms as unconscious resources used by the ego to decrease internal stress. Ultimately, people devise these unconscious mechanisms to decrease conflict within themselves. So specifically between the superego and the id, which we will touch on later as well. Psychodynamic therapy is used by clinicians to help patients or people to understand their unconscious processes. So by recognizing and identifying these processes, we can then start to improve our self-awareness and gain a new understanding of our own behaviors and how those show up for us in the world, right? So these insights can be helpful to, it could be clients or to people with a variety of mental disorders, right? So whether it be depression, anxiety, eating disorders, and personality disorders, or for today's example, might just be creating stronger relationships through understanding of each other. Okay, so next slide.
Before we go to the next slide, I just want to say how it's nice that we're starting off on a positive note with defense mechanisms. Like, there's pure intentions when it comes to decreasing internal stress, but I'm sure you'll talk about how it can come across as negative, but it is truly a pure intention when they appear.
Yeah, right. So yeah, that is something we will touch on in the future, but yeah, there is an understanding behind them that it's not all bad, right? So there will be occurrences where we're going to learn adaptive, right? So yeah, let's continue to the next slide. So as we progress from childhood to adolescence and then progress from adolescent into adulthood, these psychological defenses can persist from one phase to the next, regress to earlier phases, in response to stressors or evolve over time, right? So they're interchangeable and they can evolve or regress, right? So they do change over our lifespans. So also defense mechanisms can be internalized or externalized, resulting in corresponding behavior, right? So internalized means it's something that we experience internally, and it could be an internal conflict, or it could be externalized, which means it could be projected onto our environment or our loved ones, right? So having a thorough understanding of defense mechanisms can help an individual create deeper and more meaningful relationships, right? So for example, recognizing the presence of defense mechanisms, whether within yourself or others during an argument, can help maintain the appropriate response to such situation, right? So I think it's important to preface that by saying, I am not encouraging anyone to therapize their loved one or someone in their life. This is just a means of understanding what psychological barriers we might be up against, right? So we can come into conversation with empathy and with understanding, rather than what the most common thing is. What people do is, someone has their defense up, we also put our defenses up as well, right? And that's where conflict arises and solution usually doesn't come about, right? So this is more of a means for you to be able to understand the overall underlying mechanisms that are at play when you're talking to other people. I just wanted to touch on that. Also, if defense mechanisms are identified in adolescence, it can help to predict further development of personality disorders, right? So if you're able to identify these mechanisms at a younger age, pinpoint it, and have empathy and compassion with the person at hand, then that, that results in better results for the future of that person's mental health. So depending on the context and the severity, defense mechanisms can be either maladaptive and adaptive, right? So that's what Cassandra was talking about in the previous slide about there are ranges when it comes to defense mechanisms, whether they're being maladaptive or adaptive, right? So adaptive means that you're expressing them in a healthy, adaptive means you're expressing it in a healthy way, right? That is, that leads to positive outcomes in your life. And I will explain that more in the future as we talk about each of them. But just know that if it's adaptive, it means that it's positive and you are integrating it into your life in a healthy manner, right? Rather than maladaptive, where it's in a negative manner and it also comes with negative consequences to it as well.
Yes, I just wanted to touch on a point that you mentioned with your example of, not to therapize, like couples, relationships. It really is about communicating with understanding, right? I know there's so much memes that say like, it's not just the communication that matters in relationship, but it's the understanding. And it is truly that perspective that helps automatically decrease someone's defense mechanisms, right? So that was a great point that I just wanted to bring in.
Yeah, right. Because, that's another thing that we face in therapy a lot, is that, in teaching our clients about others, we don't want them to go on the flip side and want to be, say, the archetype of the fixer, right? Wanting to fix other people's problems. You have to go in with with the intent of compassion and understanding, right? Because we're there to understand rather than to fix, right? And I think that's a beautiful way to look at it. Okay, perfect. Okay, let's move to the next slide. Okay. Right, so in this slide, we're going to be explaining a little bit more about, one sec, sorry. Right, we're going to be explaining more about the id, the ego, and the super ego. right? So as we progress from childhood to adolescence and then progress from adolescent, sorry, from adolescence into adulthood, these psychological defenses can persist from one phase to the next. Wait, is that my notes from the last one? Yeah, hold on.
No, that sounds like this slide.
Yeah, so that was the last slide because
Oh,
I just put presenter view on, so it went back a slide. But we are on id, ego, and super ego slide.
yes.
Okay, yeah. So the id houses our basic needs, impulses, and desires. Simply, the id acts as a hedonistic pleasure center whose primary goal is to satisfy our basic needs and drives in life, right? So the ego is responsible for how we react to, function in, and make sense of the external world. The ego controls the demands of impulses of the id and is home to our consciousness, right? And then on the other side, we have the superego. The superego, the superego hoses all of the rules that we have learned throughout our life and uses these to control the ego. The superego is also home to the expectations of the ego, the way we think we should behave and think, right? So we have the id, which is kind of hedonistic, which means it just wants pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. Then we have the superego, which is in charge of things like morality and what we think is right and societally right and what our parents taught us, right? The proper way to do things. And then in between the two of those, we have the id, which the id is kind of a mediator between the two of them. So a lot of these, right, I mean, the ego is a mediator between the id and the superego, right? So a lot of these defense mechanisms is actually the ego having an attempt to subside anxieties that we feel when we're conflicted between those two, right? So that's when these defenses will actually come up. So, right, so ideally the id, ego, and super ego interact in concert and harmoniously. However, each component can cause anxiety within an individual, right? And this is where Sigmund Freud argued that when placed in a psychologically dangerous or threatening situation, a person is more likely to resort to defense mechanisms, right? Like I was saying. So if there's a danger or a threat in place, something that challenged the person's self-concept or self-esteem, then these defense mechanisms will pop out for us. Right, so that's it for that slide. Okay, how do defense mechanisms affect communication, right? So many researchers place defense mechanisms on a continuum, right? Like we were saying before, from adaptive to maladaptive, and even mature to immature, right? So there's different continuums that they fall on. So defenses improving cognitive process and less mature ones causing harm. So in the long term, mature defense mechanisms may not be particularly detrimental to your emotional or mental health, but using more mature mechanisms may help you face the anxieties in situation that might normally cause stress and emotional duress, right? So on a day-to-day basis, they're not super harmful to us, but over time, if you continually use maladaptive ones, it can show up in your life more detrimentally, and in your relationships, of course, right? So other defense mechanisms, however, are not as mature and helpful, and over time, if you continually use them, they will cause prolonged problems which will linger. Right. So in fact, they may even prevent you from ever facing emotional issues or anxieties because they essentially block you from seeing the root cause of the problem. Right. So the importance of defense mechanisms helps us to, So by exploring our psychological defense mechanisms, we can better understand how to communicate and how our communications are shaped, right? Through self-awareness and a conscious effort, we can improve our ability to defend ourselves and others in any social situation, right? So this is helpful not just for you, but also for those around you, so you can identify them when they do come up around you.
So I'm not sure if you touch on this later in the presentation, but I'm curious to know like what helps towards more mature mechanisms, because that's ultimately the goal, right?
Right. So um it's not so much that there's something that helps towards it being more mature. It's more that each of them are on a scale from immature to mature. So like if we think of one, like we'll get more into it, but regression is you going back into your childlike state, right? So that can never be a mature defense mechanism, because it calls you to act in childish ways and respond in emotionally immature ways. So some of them are just categorized as immature and some are categorized as mature. So
Okay.
there's no way to specifically make one more mature than the other.
Right. Yeah, this I guess it's context dependent, but also just state dependent. Okay. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So next slide. Right. So perfect. So we're going into them now. On the next few slides, we're going to be going to some very common defense mechanisms that we might face in our day-to-day life, whether internally or externally, whether at home or at work or with family, whatever it might be. Like I said before, it's important that we're not using these to therapize others, right? We're using them to get a better understanding of others, to have more compassion and love towards each other, right? So for this first one, we have repression and suppression, which we can label as burying our emotions, right? So repression is one of the most commonly used defense mechanisms in communication. It involves pushing away unwanted emotions and memories to protect ourselves from emotional pain. Right? But however, when we use this one excessively, it can lead to negative consequences on our mental health, right? So that's the important thing to remember, that these defense mechanisms are all adaptive in some aspect, in some way, because they were created for our survival, right? So in some circumstances, it might be important to suppress, right, our emotions, like maybe our brains are overwhelmed or we're not able to conceptualize or understand everything in that moment, and we might need to save that for later, right? But it becomes maladaptive when we continually do that to the point where we're not able to fully remember or experience our emotions of certain events, right? That's when it becomes maladaptive, right? So in this situation, right, between repression and suppression, um, let me explain suppression first. So suppression is the conscious effort to avoid certain thoughts, feelings, and behaviors to keep them out of consciousness, right? And the difference between repression and suppression is that, suppression is conscious, which means that I am consciously choosing not to say um, something or to recall something, right? So say, for example, a person is in a marriage and they're having a fight. Let's call her Amy. Amy is having a fight with her husband, and her husband is asking her questions about her ex-husband. And let's say in her past relationship, her and her ex-husband had an abusive relationship, right? So there's a lot of trauma there for Amy, and it's hard for her to open up about this event, right? So suppression in this situation would be if Amy makes a conscious effort to not tell her present husband about these things. So that might look like ignoring the question, going on her phone. It might look like changing the topic, right? Or just crying to avoid talking about the topic. Right? So some type of way to divert herself from that conversation consciously. And then repression, on the other hand, would be the subconscious effort of doing that, right? So repression is not something that we do, it's something that just happens, right? So in that specific situation, it would be if Amy's husband asked her about her past relationship, but Amy cannot recall what happened, right? She just remembers feeling really sad in that marriage, but she can't remember all of the altercations that she had with her husband. Maybe police were involved, or maybe there was a night where things got really bad, but Amy cannot remember the details of what happened that night, right? And that is repression. That's her mind's way of protecting us from, memories that we're not currently ready to process. Right.
And I think this also just goes back to even both approaches, right, to defense mechanisms. It goes back to it being pure, right? There's a reason why defense mechanisms are innate. As you said, we use them for survival mode, but as with everything in life, we need moderation, right? So much of one thing is typically not the best. So just want to highlight that.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So that's why I keep saying that on every slide, right? It's important to know that we do need these. We do need suppression. We do need repression, right? We do need these things to give our brains the space that they need to process these things. But I think the important thing is to recognize when I am doing that. So instead of repression, instead of suppression, it might be that I need space, or I need therapy, or I need time, right? I can start to recognize what it is that I actually need, right? Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so denial and projection, right? So denial, refusing to accept reality. Denial is another common defense mechanism used in communication. It involves refusing to accept reality to protect oneself from emotional distress. While it can be helpful in the short term, long-term use of this can lead to significant consequences. Right? So for denial, an example is someone who denies that they have an alcohol or substance abuse issue because, maybe they're good at their job and they're able to show up every day, or what we might call, a functional alcoholic or something like that, where, you're not ready to accept the reality of what things are, so you deny the facts that are in front of you. Right? So next is projection. So blaming others for personal issues. So projection is a defense mechanism where individuals attribute their negative qualities or emotions onto others. This helps them to avoid confronting uncomfortable thoughts or feelings about themselves. However, it can be harmful in relationships and hinder personal growth. Right? So an example of projection would be a person who's having an affair, but accuses their partner of infidelity, right? So this would be, we're holding in some negative thoughts and feelings about maybe, what we're doing or who we are. And then instead of sitting with those feelings, we project those outwards onto the people around us, right? So we might put those same judgments that we have for ourselves onto others, right? So if I feel like I'm incompetent, then I might start to accuse other people of being like that, right? So that's what projection would look like. Okay, next one. Okay, rationalization and intellectualization, right? And I think I see a lot of intellectualization in sessions and in relationships. So we'll talk a little bit about that, but let's start with rationalization. So justifying actions. Rationalization is a defense mechanism that involves justifying one's actions with logical reasons to cope with feelings of guilt or discomfort. It can help reduce anxiety in the short term, but it can also lead to avoidance or of personal responsibility. So let's give an example of what rationalization is. So as we can see in the picture, you see that there is a test and he's holding it up. It has an F on it. And then he says, I failed because my teacher hates me, right? So in this situation, he failed because he didn't study, right? He wasn't prepared. He was ill prepared for the test, right? But rationalization, he's able to rationalize that to himself and make up another reason for what caused the outcome that he received, right? Instead of looking internally and taking accountability for what the true contributors are to him failing that test. That's what rationalization would look like. Then we have intellectualization, right? And I see a lot of clients who have been through traumatic experiences, whether in childhood or throughout life, use this defense mechanism a lot. So it involves focusing on logic. Intellectualization is a defense mechanism where individuals focus on logic and objective analysis to avoid emotional discomfort. So while this can be helpful in problem solving, it can also lead to lack of emotional understanding and connection, right? So as we talked about on that spectrum, it can be positive, it can be an adaptive thing, right? It's important to understand the logic of a situation, right? I always say you need 50% logic and 50% emotion, right? So you need to be able to understand in a given situation, what are the logical aspects to this situation? What do I need to know? What do I need to research? What do I need to think about? How do I make meaning of what is happening to me, right? That is very important. But the problem arises is when we do this too much, right? It becomes maladaptive, where it gets to the point where you have such a great understanding, right? Like, say we're talking about trauma. You might have a great understanding of trauma. You know, you might know all of the modalities, all of the psychologists, you might watch all of the podcasts, right? But then it takes away from our ability to actually feel that information. It becomes just an abstract logical concept rather than an emotional experience, right? And sometimes we have to slow that down and be able to sit with ourselves and to analyze and ask ourselves, what am I feeling right now? What am I feeling in this moment? What do I need in this moment? Rather than how can I fix it? How can I understand it? So yeah, a lot of the times with clients with intellectualization, it's getting back to our feelings. What are we actually feeling?
Before
Right.
I continue,
Okay.
it's the more you speak on these examples, the more I just want to emphasize how everything really does need moderation, right? Because being too close to our emotions is dangerous because now we're dysregulated. We're not getting the appropriate adaptive information from the experience, but being too distant from the emotions, we're not connecting with ourselves. We're not being able to get those important pieces of information to know how to respond adaptively, right? So again, understanding that defense mechanisms are pure, they are there for our survival. Yet at the same time, all the examples are the defense pushing you further away from self, right? And even pushing you further away from others in communication. Um, it's such a layered thing. I'm just like, okay, like
Yeah.
you
Right. Yeah.
my juices are flowing.
Right. It really seems like it's something you have to figure out on your own what that balance is for you, right? It seems like it's a very subjective experience, right? For each person, it might be different, and the spectrum might be different for each person. But I think, like Cassandra said, after a prolonged time of being in a maladaptive state, I think you will start to recognize symptoms from that, right? And I think in my practice, a lot of that is clients coming in and saying, I feel numb, I am not feeling, or I'm not able to recognize when I'm feeling something, right? So there will be signs for you to know, okay, maybe I'm spending too much time in the logic side of things, maybe I'm intellectualizing things, right? And even sometimes therapy in itself can be an intellectualization, right? Because you're coming to get more understanding of what you're going through. But that's why we need an equal balance of both. We need an equal balance of understanding and an equal balance of just feeling what we're feeling and just being there with our feelings. Right. So the example here for intellectualization is Greg learns that he has cancer He begins to learn everything he can about the illness, reading books, journal articles, and the latest experimental research, right? Which it's great that he's doing that. And, we're not saying that we're against learning about something that you're going through. It's more of, is that taking away from your ability to feel what you're going through, right? And making sure you're doing a balance of both of those things. Okay.
Yes, there's so much. Sorry, I said something else.
Yeah, no, go ahead. Go ahead.
There's so much when it comes to language, right, and communication in terms of, for Greg, and in this example, if he's talking about cancer in a third person type of way, like, oh, cancer, this impacts the, and on an educational basis versus, okay, I have it.
Yeah.
Like, what does it mean that I have it? What am I learning with how to take care of myself and maybe change my lifestyle so I can overcome it? Right. So absolutely becoming too, yes, of course, mindfulness is great, but becoming too stuck in mind and in, yeah, the externalization, it doesn't help process what is going on.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that, Cassandra, because I think what that elaborates on is that sometimes intellectualization can get us stuck in our heads, right? Where you understand the logical side of things, but what are the next steps to overcome it? And that usually has to do with emotions. What do I need to feel to get over this? What do I feel like I need in this moment? Right? So a lot of the time movement comes with emotion, right? It's a flowing energy, right? So what do I need to feel in this moment to overcome this challenge, right? Because if we stay in the logic side, we can learn as much as we want on a topic, but we might still feel stuck, right? So exactly, it's important to feel those emotions as well. Okay, let's move to the next slide. Okay, undoing and sublimation. Right. So undoing is a psychological defense mechanism where individuals try to undo their past actions or words by performing opposite actions or saying something nice to alleviate guilt or anxiety. Right. So I think we see this a lot in day-to-day life. But the example that I have here is a man buys roses for his wife the day after a big argument. So there's nothing wrong with buying some roses for your wife after a day of a big argument. But the problem with this, why it becomes undoing, is because there needs to be some type of conflict resolution in between that happening, right? So just because we say something nice or we give someone a nice gift, that doesn't take away from whatever the conflict was before, or if we did something that we need to apologize for, right? Guilt is not always a bad thing. Sometimes guilt lets us know that we did something wrong and we need to apologize or we need to take accountability, right? So in this specific situation, right, maybe there is some need from space, some need for space in that relationship. Maybe they took a night without talking. Of course, making sure that we're not stonewalling, which is, when we just go cold without explaining why. Maybe we are explaining to our wives that, I need the night to just sleep on this and think about it, and then I'll get back to you tomorrow, right? So we're saying that we need the space, and we're communicating when we will be back, right? So he says he'll be back tomorrow. Then tomorrow we can talk about that conflict, right? We can break it down, what happened, how it made each of us feel, take accountability for our actions, and make a plan for how we're going to move forward in the future, right? And see how there's so many more processes in between that, rather than showing up tomorrow with flowers, right? Because the flowers is an attempt to take back everything that happened that night, which that's not very good for conflict resolution. We need to be able to break down what happened, what do we need, how can we compromise, and how can we move forward in a fashion that works out better for both of us in the future, right? So another example of this as well is excessively praising someone after you insult them, right? So it's similar to the other example I just gave, where there's guilt after we do something bad, and then we feel like doing or saying something will fix everything, right? But like I said before, it doesn't. We have to make sure we have that proper communication when those feelings of guilt and anxiety come up for us, instead of trying to do or say something to fix it right away. Okay, so Sublimation. Sublimation is a psychological defense mechanism where negative emotions are channeled into creative or productive outlets. Right, so learning how to use sublimation can be advantageous for healthy communication and for your mental well-being, right? So when we talk about maladaptive and adaptive, sublimation would be more on the side of adaptive coping mechanisms, right? Doesn't mean it can't be maladaptive, it definitely can, but if we were to put it on a scale, sublimation would be up there closer to the top because, if anyone here has been to therapy or is planning on going there, we create healthy coping mechanisms, right? So ways in which you can channel your emotions into more creative or productive outlets, that is something you might work on in therapy. So it can be healthy, right? But I think the problem is, like we said in the other slides, is overdoing it, right? So for the example we have here, right? So 1 second, sorry. Right, so the example we have here, right, is letting off steam at the gym, right? So Lucy has a lot of pent-up hostility towards her coworkers who she finds lazy and irresponsible. So several times a week she goes to the gym for one-to-one kickboxing lessons, right? So cathartic, right? She's letting off some steam, she's putting her anger in another place, right? Which is something that is healthy. Number two, another example, staying busy to overcome loneliness, right? So that's one we see a lot, right? Where there might be a discomfort or anxiety in being alone. So we might end up doing a lot. We might end up working a lot, or we might end up hanging out with friends a lot, right? So the example here is Marla doesn't like being alone. It makes her feel unwanted and is deeply hurtful. To compensate, she has joined so many social groups at school that nearly every moment outside of class is filled with club activities, right? So I think the second one definitely sounds more maladaptive than the first one, but the first one definitely could get maladaptive as well, right? So if we were getting overwhelmed all the time and the gym was the first thing we think of, definitely a good coping mechanism, but are we overdoing it, right? Are we always taking our emotions to the gym without understanding what we're feeling, unpacking what we're feeling, right? That's always the important thing. What is the mental process behind doing some of these things, right? Am I aware of what I'm feeling and what I'm doing and the consequences of doing these things, right?
Yes, the awareness piece. I wanted to comment on the second example because I too have a lot of clients that cope with this level of avoidance,
Yeah.
right? So they're doing so much trying to escape with how they feel that it becomes so part of their norm that they actually forget that they're escaping, right? So they come in, they're talking about burnout, they're stressed, like we're building on so much other mental health concerns by avoiding the root concern, right? So once okay, sure, here's some, not examples, here's some tools to deal with burnout. Then they're dealing with it. We find out there's more, there's more, there's more. So it really is something to be mindful of how you are coping with things because they can exacerbate to different mental health concerns than where it started, right? And I also want to say too, with our live viewers, if you have any questions, please do put it in the chat as well, and Janelle or myself will be happy to answer them.
Yes. Right. Yeah. Thank you, Cassandra, for that, because it really is that moderation, like we've been saying over the progress of this stream, is that there really needs to be a level of awareness to the moderation to each of these, right? So, like Cassandra said, some clients come in and they're really doing a lot. They're doing all of these great things. They're doing yoga, they're doing gym, they're doing rock climbing, they're doing, brunch with the friends and time with the family on the weekend, right? But then it becomes a place of, is this avoidance? Is there something that you're avoiding by doing all of these things? And sometimes it's hard to find that because, the person might be so proud of themselves for doing all of these things. And I mean, they should be, because it is a challenge to do things sometimes. So, even though that is important, you have to sit with yourself and ask yourself, what does this mean? Why am I filling up my schedule so much? Why am I, leading to burnout, to the point of burnout where, my capacity is filled with, whether it's work things, school things, kids, family, right? All of these different aspects of your life is taking up all of your time, right? We have to sit with the anxiety and the truth of the situation. Why am I overbooking myself? What are the emotions behind the anxiety that drives me to do all of these things, right? Whether, like in the example, loneliness, right? That could be an example of an emotion that's buried behind the anxiety to do. Or we might discover other emotions that might be behind the anxiety and the feelings to do, right? So understanding what the emotions are behind our reasoning to do the things that we do.
Yes, I felt like snapping through you were speaking. I think yes, that's really what it is. And still
Yeah.
acknowledging this is a hard task to do by yourself. And that's why, we do truly welcome new clients to come in and speak about these concerns. But I'll change it to the next slide.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so now we have displacement and disassociation, right? And this is one that comes up a lot in couples therapy, working with couples and families, right? Or intimate relationships, right? So displacement is transferring one's emotional burden or emotional reaction from one entity to another, right? So this defense mechanism may be present in someone who has a stressful day at work and then lashes out against their family at home, right? So displacement, let's talk a little bit about how it could be adaptive, right? So displacement could be adaptive because it allows us to be able to, you know, hold and then release our emotions at appropriate times, right? So for example, the example that was given in the slide is, you go to work and your boss makes you upset, but you understand that you're not able to, react the way that you want to due to the professional environment or due to, fear of losing your job, and you have to take care of your family, all of these things, right? So logically, you're understanding this is not an environment where I can fully express myself in the way I might want to, right? But I understand that I have to do that to maintain keeping my position, right? So you have a stressful day at work with your boss, and then you go home to your husband or your wife or to your family, or if you live with your friends, whoever you live with, and then, they might do something that's irritating to you, and then you might just blow up and lash out, right? And then everyone is confused about what is going on. Why is this person so angry, right? That is displacement, right? That was a buildup of all of the anger at work, right? There was a buildup of anger that you didn't feel like you could properly release of in that environment because it was unsafe to do so at work, right? So once you get home, this anger is increased, and then small things, it might be the dishes, it might be someone didn't do something they said that they would do, or someone's not home on time, and now we are in a blowout, or you're having miscommunication at home, right? So I think it's important to understand displacement, especially in family dynamics and relationships, so that we can start to manage the stress and the frequency of blowouts at home, so we can understand when someone is doing that, maybe it's, if it is work and it's not here, it's like, how can you manage your stress at work, right? So if you're reflecting on yourself, you're like, yeah, I do that. How can I manage my stress at work, or have a way that I can sublimation no, yeah, sublimation, that I can find a healthier way to release the anger that I'm feeling, so that I don't take it out on the people that I love, right? Um right. right? So disassociation. Disassociation involves feeling disconnected from a stressful or traumatic event, or feeling that the event is not really happening. It's a way to block out mental trauma and protect the mind from experiencing too much stress. Right. So this is also one that I see a lot in relationships. But it can happen anywhere and anytime, right? Even if you're just daydreaming, sometimes that's disassociation, and that's the adaptive version of it, right? It's just a simple daydream, right? Maybe you're stressed at work or you're bored and you're just thinking about your last vacation somewhere, right? And that could be an adaptive form because it's not causing too much harm for you, right? But a lot of the times when people have experienced trauma in the past, this defense mechanism comes about in a way to protect the person from the discomfort in the stressful situation, right? So, for example, if someone grew up in a chaotic household where there was always screaming and yelling and fighting, right? And their way to get away was reading or going on their iPad or going on their phone, right? They have created a pattern of disassociation to deal with stress, right? So, say in couples therapy, a lot of the times, you know, there might be two people might be in the midst of a very important argument, right? Where both parties are trying to get their point across, right? And it's a heated conversation. And then one of the partners starts to disengage, right? They start to go on their phone, they start to look away, they start to daydream, they start looking down, right? These are signs that someone might be disassociating, right? And the partner that's witnessing this might be like, this person doesn't care, they don't love me, they don't care enough to listen when I need them to listen the most, not realizing that that might be a trauma response, and that environment has become so stressful for them that this defense mechanism has come out for them, right? So in a therapeutic environment, we might just point that out, right? Right. I realize that when we talk about this topic, you tend to disengage, you tend to go on your phone. Is there something that's coming up for you? Is there something that you're feeling? Right. And in asking those questions, we can start to understand what the emotions might be behind the disassociation, what the stress might be, and um, how we can create right conversation in a way that doesn't trigger that person to dissociate. Um, but yeah, it definitely can be adaptive and maladaptive, just like the others.
And I want to comment on displacement, right? Because there is such a significant difference in needing boundaries and using defense mechanisms,
Mm,
right? If boundary is okay, you work made you activated, and that was work, and then you come home and you disturb what home can be. It's that boundary of work and home, right, versus that defense that is needed. But I am curious in its simplest terms, because the word transferring is also used in displacement as it's used in projection, right? How would you describe the difference in projection and displacement?
right. Projection and displacement. Right.
Yeah.
So right.
Mhm.
So this displacement would be transferring one emotion from one environment to the next, while projection is more of you're transferring your own internal like ideas and insecurities onto another person,
Right.
right? So projection comes from a place of, this is my internal experience, so others must be experiencing that as well,
Right.
right? So I'm incompetent or I'm nervous, so you must be too, right? And then displacement is more of, this person made me angry and I didn't have the environment to let out that anger. So now I have moved that to this place or this person, which seems better equipped for me to be able to do that, right? Because displacement is saying it's unsafe to feel what you feel in this environment, but it's safe to do it in this environment. So let me do it in this environment. That's right. So in a really messed up way, it's a way of saying I'm really comfortable with my home environment. I'm really comfortable with my partner, right? But it's obviously not a healthy way to show that. But it does reflect that. It reflects the fact that I can let my guards down. I feel safe enough to let anger manifest here. But obviously, that is not the way to go, right? But that is the flip side of looking at it, that this person feels comfortable to release these negative emotions around me.
There is that saying that I'm about to change the slide right now, but
Yeah.
there is that saying that we hurt those that are closest to us, right? Like if we bump into a stranger in the street, like, oh sorry, especially if Canadian, like, oh so sorry, but if it's we bump into like our partner or sibling, it's like no acknowledgement that you just hit another person, right? So even if by accident, but that's interesting. Okay, next slide.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that. So splitting and regression. Right. So before I get into these two, I want to continue to remind everyone that this presentation is not a substitution for therapy, right? And sometimes dealing with things like this, splitting and regression, they're on a deeper level of like trauma and subconsciousness, right? So there's only so much you can do with understanding someone who demonstrates these versions of defense mechanisms. And sometimes understanding is not enough. Sometimes we might need help. Sometimes we might need to go to therapy, and it might not be enough for one person to just come with understanding and empathy to be able to help or mend a relationship here, right? So let's first start with splitting, which is typically refers to an immature defense mechanism where it becomes polarized in views of self and others, and this arises due to intolerable sorry, conflicting emotions, right? So a person employing splitting may idealize someone at one time, seeing them as a person as all good, and then devalue them in the next moment, seeing them as an all bad person, right? So splitting is a common symptom of BPD, right? So that's something we'll see a lot in BPD clients. So it's this all or nothing thinking, right? It can definitely arise in anyone, where you see things as all good, all bad, people are all trusting, or I want nothing to do with them, right? So it's very black and white. And this defense mechanism, why it was adaptive, most of the times it's in childhood, right? Where the person needed to be able to see people as like good or bad to be able to survive in the environment that they had, right? Because seeing that person, maybe it's a caretaker, seeing them as good and bad was too much a risk for them to take in their young days, right? So for example, right, if mom was always shouting and yelling and unpredictable, right, it would have been unsafe for a child to see mom as a good person, right? So they tend to alternate between, okay, she's really good or she's really bad. And that made it easier to protect self, to protect your ego, right? To protect your anxieties and your fears. So that can transcend into adulthood, where we see that. I think a lot of the times that we see it is like, say, you're having a really good relationship with someone, and then you do one thing, you mess up once, and then all of a sudden maybe they block you or delete you or never talk to you again over that one situation, right? Because they weren't able to conceptualize that. They weren't able to get a grasp of the fact that you could still be a good person even though you did one bad thing or you made one mistake, right? So this can definitely become a situation that's unpredictable. But like I said before, right, maybe make sure you're taking care of your mental health, making sure that you're giving this person ample space and setting clear boundaries with them, right? So that they're able to figure out everything that's going on with them. Of course, encourage therapy if you can, if you have that type of relationship with them, to be able to get a better view on people and trust and all good and all bad perspectives. Okay, so regression. So in response to stress or distress, clients display age inappropriate behavior. That is, they regress or move back to an earlier developmental stage and adopt immature patterns of behavior and emotions. Regression is considered maladaptive, since more emotionally mature behaviors and thought processes are more likely to aid in problem solving and coping, right? So that answers that question, Cassandra, that we were talking about. Regression is an example of a defense mechanism where it's kind of challenging to come up with a way that it's adaptive, right? Because it brings us back to an earlier developmental stage. So technically there's no way it can be, it's adaptive in the fact that it's for survival, right? You're doing it for a reason. You do all of these for a reason. So it's protecting the psyche, but at the same time, there's no benefit probably other than that in this specific situation. Because, as a child, you're probably acting out, you're probably screaming and yelling and clawing and, being possessive or whatever it might be, whatever that child state might be. That's what regression would look like. It would look like going back to an earlier stage to deal with the stress that you're feeling in the environment or the present situation. Right. So for an example for regression, so in response to the news that his parents are getting divorced, Gary has displayed behavior that is more typical of younger children. Right. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is the start of talking about some of the ways in which we can manage defenses when we're communicating with others, right? So we're going to be talking about taking accountability, managing your emotions, active listening, constructive feedback, and therapy. Okay, taking accountability, right? So an antidote to defensiveness is in relationships is to take responsibility for your own feelings, your part in the argument, and to express a sincere interest in learning more about your spouse's stance. This includes not blaming your spouse. It's about acknowledging your part, being able to express your thoughts and feelings, and taking an interest in your spouse's feelings, right? This can allow defenses to go down and can bridge a friendship through seeing each other as a teammate, viewing each other as a friendly partner versus adversary. When we begin blaming, criticizing, and becoming defensive, we move into seeing our spouse or our friends or people that are close to us in an adversarial road, right? So in a conflict like a conflict viewpoint, right? Like you might want to fight and be abrasive. But when we move into this new way of relating, we can deepen our understanding and connection of each other and hopefully come out on the other side with more understanding and a deeper emotional connection to each other, right? So I think that doubles down with what we've been saying before about understanding how, your emotions are interacting with the person that you're communicating with. That is so important to communication. I think a lot of the times we go into relationships or, communication dynamics where we believe the other person is always the one to blame. And I think sometimes we need to take a step back and realize how we're responding, how we are also maybe shouting, yelling, ignoring, what am I doing to contribute to this conflict? What are my defenses, right? Because defenses aren't just one person or 50% of the population. We all have them, right? So if they have defenses, you have defenses too. And if they become defensive, you're more likely to do the same. So how am I contributing to this? What accountability can I take? How can I own up to my own triggers to make sure that I'm taking in account my own feelings and their separate feelings away from mine? Okay, next slide.
Yes, I just wanted to say a quick point of the emphasis on friendly, whether it is partner, whether it is another relationship, is not viewing that other person as an enemy, right? Which automatically can help decrease how much defenses are present, or at least how long they last in communication. Right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's kind of connected to the black and white thinking that we talked about, right? It's like just because we're having a conflict doesn't mean that you're the enemy. Doesn't mean that you're all bad, right? Because if we go in with the perspective that this person, I just cannot get along with this person is horrible, this person is bad, right? These types of negative views of that person is not conducive with mending and creating a positive relationship in between the two of you, right? So going with the view that I make mistakes, I'm taking accountability for mine, and I understand you will also make mistakes and you have defenses because you've been through things just like me, right? With that perspective, right? Now we're letting our guard down. Now we're taking down those barriers. We're starting to realize like we're humans, right? We're humans. We all have defenses. We all mess up. We all make mistakes. We all get upset, and those defenses come out sometimes. Right. Okay. Next slide. Okay. Managing your emotions, right? So identifying your triggers and managing emotional reactions during communication, this can help you to stay calm, collected during challenging conversations, right? And definitely this can be very challenging, especially in the heat of the moment, being able to manage your emotions when someone might be yelling, screaming, calling you names, whatever it might be, to really, regain yourself and be mindful of your present moment. So some things you could do is maybe breathe, right? Maybe you need to just slow down that breathing or focus on your breath, while you're in this stressful environment to try to regulate your emotions, right? So breath is one of the easiest ways to become mindful, right? We want to be mindful again, right? Because when we get into the subconscious, a lot of the time we might be disassociated. We might not be in the present moment. When you're filled with anger, you're not really present and logical and understanding what is going on around you, right? So mindfulness, it can be the breath, it can be the body. So focusing on your body, focusing on your surrounding, anything that can ground you back into the present moment to make sure that your emotions are in check, right? Because if someone's getting angry and the other person's getting angry, there's not going to be productive communication there, right? There's not going to be a resolve at the end, right? There's just going to be more defenses up, your defense is up, my defense is up, and there's no resolution at the end, right? So trying to say a mantra, right? That's another way to stay grounded, acknowledging and labeling your feelings, right? So that goes with accountability, right? Understanding this is what I am feeling and actually giving it a name, right? There's actually therapeutic benefits to actually saying what it is that you're feeling, right? I'm feeling insecure. I'm feeling anxious. I'm feeling lonely. I'm feeling afraid, right? What are the feelings that I'm feeling, right? Right. And if you need to pull out your emotion wheel, right? Because not everyone has the vocabulary for emotions, right? Maybe you need to pull out your emotion wheel and check, what am I feeling in this moment? Right. And maybe to do that, you need to take a break. That's the last one, a break, take a break. Always know when you need to take a break when you're experiencing conflict with a loved one. It is so important. And what I was talking about before was, the difference between taking a break and stonewalling. Always make sure you're saying, I am going to take this space. I need this space right now, and this is the time when I will be back, right? I respect what you're saying. I respect what you're feeling in this moment. but I need to take some time for myself, right? So whether you need a couple hours, you need a day, whatever it might be, communicate that and take a break, and you can come back to the conversation or the conflict again with a fresh pair of eyes, right? To dismantle everything that's going on. Okay. Okay. Active listening, right? So active listening is a technique that we use as therapists that, a lot of people don't know and should know about, right? Learn how to actively listen and reflect on what the other person is saying, right? This can help prevent misunderstandings and promote empathy in your relationship, right? So I think that's similar to what we were saying before, right? Like, what is your mindset going into the conflict, right? Am I here to fight, disagree, right? Is the ego in place where I'm trying to look better or be better than my partner or friend? Or am I here to listen and try to understand, right? And if it's a second one where you're here to listen and to understand, then active listening is definitely essential, right? So what that looks like is being fully present in the conversation, right? So am I looking around? Am I on my phone? Or am I, observant and being mindful of being in the present moment with my partner or my friend, right? Showing interest by practicing good eye contact and noticing and using nonverbal cues, right? So being keen to recognize what your body language looks like, right? So am I making good and proper eye contact with my partner? Am I demonstrating open body language, right? So a lot of the times in session, one person might be on one end of the couch, one person is on the other end of the couch, right? Feet are turned outwards, arms might be crossed, right? Does my body language demonstrate or represent what I'm coming here to do, right? I'm coming here to build connection, to listen, to understand. Does my body language represent that? Asking open-ended questions to encourage further responses, right? So try not to ask questions that are yes or no's. Try to encourage the person to talk about, what they're thinking, what they're feeling, to get a full understanding of what is going on with them. Paraphrasing and reflecting back what has been said, right? So active listening is not just replying to the person, right? It's also letting the person know, I understand what you're saying to me, and we can do that by repeating what they've said to us, right? So, it sounds like you're having a pretty rough day, and then you got a call from your mom as well, and that was upsetting. So it seems like you're having a hard time, right? So that would be an example of just repeating what the person has said to you, right? So that would be paraphrasing and reflecting back what has been said. And that's just to ensure that the person feels heard, they feel like they're being listened to. And that breaks down some of the barriers as well when it comes to defenses. Because as humans, we all like to be listened to and heard, right? And being attentive and reflecting back is a good way to do that. Okay. Listening to understand rather than to respond, right? And that goes along with everything that we've been saying, which is understanding that you're not here to fight. You're here to understand. You're here to get a better understanding of what is going on with a person, right? So when we talk about this whole presentation, right, it's about gaining an understanding of the people that you love, right? It's not to fix them. It's not to judge them. It's not to, it's not anything but to gain understanding. And through understanding, we can have compassion and empathy for them, right? So that is our mission, to make sure that we can learn. And through learning, we will get more compassion and understanding, right? So withholding judgment and advice. This one is very hard, but making sure that we're withholding judgment and advice. And I know that can be really hard, especially if your loved one is coming to you with a challenging circumstance and maybe you even have the answer to it, right? Or you feel like you do, right? But sometimes people just need the space to be able to express what they're feeling, what they might be feeling in that moment, what happened in the day, decompressing, right? So something that you could do in your relationships is maybe sometimes ask, right? Are you looking for support through me listening? Or are you looking for support through some advice, right? Because sometimes people do want advice, but I think it's important to clarify which one your loved one might be looking for, right? Are they looking for advice, or are they looking for emotional support? Then asking that question gives you, the green light on what you're supposed to do. Because if they say that they're looking for emotion, then there we go. We just need some active listening, right? We just need to be present, be mindful, be open, right? Listen to understand, listen without judgment, no advice, just be there in a compassionate and empathetic way. And that's all that we need. Okay, let us go to the next. Constructive feedback, right? This is one that is also very difficult sometimes in relationships in our lives, is to be able to give constructive criticism or feedback without the other person becoming defensive, right? So give and receive feedback in a constructive manner, addressing the issue rather than attacking the person. This can lead to more productive and respectful communication exchange. Right? So some of the ways which we can do that is talk about behavior and not personality, right? So a lot of the times when we get into arguments with our loved ones, we like to say, you are always like this, or you always do that, or that's just who you are, right? That's when we are attributing a mistake or a fault to personality, right? And that can be hurtful to the person who's receiving that, because essentially you're saying that it's hard or maybe impossible for them to change, rather than saying, you made a mistake and this is how it affected me. So make sure talking specifically about the behavior rather than generalizing to a person's personality. Focus on how the behavior affects you. So using I statements, right? So an example of I statement or I language would be, I worry when you don't let me know you'll be home late. Can you make a note to call me next time? Right? So in that statement, you are taking accountability for your emotion, right? So I worry when you don't let me know when you'll be home late, rather than you are always home late, right? And you make me feel this way, right? You're taking accountability. I feel that way. It's my trigger, right? When someone's home late, that is my trigger. So I'm taking accountability for that. And then I am giving you a suggestion, right? Can you make a note to call me next time? There we go, right? So be specific, right? So you want to be specific about what the issue or what the concern is, right? So no generalization like we talked before, right? So describe what you want to change instead of commanding, right? So instead of saying, stop ignoring me, suggest a specific solution. So something like, I feel loved and respected when you look at me when we're talking, right? So you're saying specifically what you need and specifically how you feel. Also, stick to the present moment, right? So let's not bring up past conflicts at that moment if that's not what we're discussing. Stay on topic with the present topic and conflict. Pick a neutral place and time, right? So once we've been in relationships for a good amount of time, we can start to get an idea of what we can call them our hot topics. So things that usually lead to a fight, right? So if you know it's a topic that usually leads to a fight, make sure you're in a neutral place and you're at a time where low stress, someone didn't just work a long shift and is tired. Making sure that we're intentional about the time and the place when we give this constructive feedback. Right. Also make a habit of giving positive feedback, right? So as humans, we don't like to always hear what we're doing wrong. We also like to hear what we're doing right, right? So make sure it's balanced on both sides, that we're also reminding our loved ones, this is what you're doing right as well, right? So if positive feedback is a part of your vocabulary, then constructive feedback definitely goes over way better. Also making ground rules, right? So in your relationship, maybe you have a rule, or when you guys want to discuss a hot topic, maybe it's no yelling, no sarcasm, no insults, no threats, no name calling, right? So make sure you talk about what the rules are going into this conflict. Okay, next slide. Okay, this is our final slide. We've made it to the end. So going to therapy with your loved ones, right? Like I have said throughout this whole presentation, which is very, very important, is therapy. Therapy is one of the best tools that you can use to break down some of these barriers and understand some of these defense mechanisms, right? Because I understand the average human, right, is you're going to work, you might have kids, you might have activities, you might have other things that you have to do. You know, maybe you don't have that extra time to sit down and become an expert on defense mechanisms, or maybe you don't want to. Like I said, you don't have to be the fixer in any relationship in your life. So this is where I would recommend going to therapy, right? So talking with a trained therapist can help you to learn healthy communication skills. Individual therapy for communication issues will involve identify what you're actually feeling, expressing your feelings in a way that draws your partner close, and asking for what you need. Healthy communication does not alienate your partner from you through blame or isolation, right? So therapy is a place you can both go. You can go individually or you can go together, right, to sort through some of these defenses and understand, you know, where they're coming from. Because a lot of the time they do come from childhood and, you know, bumps in the road from things that we've experienced. So it might be important to sit with a professional so you're able to sort through these things to make sure that you have a better relationship and communication with the people that you love in your life. Okay, that's the end.
Thank you so much, Janelle. That was a beautiful note to end with of therapy and how useful therapy truly is. Janelle is accepting new clients for those that want to continue working on their defense mechanisms or their communication or understanding someone else's defense mechanisms. Truly, you know, this is also could be a technique for some. Okay, let me attend a webinar and learn about it, then I'm good. There's work, you know, there's always more to explore. There's blind spots, so please do reach out, if not to One Piece Therapy, then, you know, somewhere to get the support you do need. Our information will be in the description box below, but for those that are live, please visit our website at onepiecetherapy.ca. And again, thank you so much, Janelle. Thank you so much, viewers, and we'll see you next time.
Okay, thank you guys for attending and take care.